Welcome back to the Shuffle Squad. Zach Lesage here. Today we're going to be going over a tier list for decks as we approach Bologna special events, the last major event that we have in our Journey Together format. We're going to see which decks have kind of come out on top, which decks are kind of well positioned as we approach the metagame. I've pretty much only chose decks that have made day 2 or have had some kind of decent significance. So if your favorite deck isn't here, I mean, we're going to be moving on to Destined Rivals. We'll kind of refresh our decks there, but hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know what decks you like in this format in the comments below. I'm going to kind of dive into it, and I'm sorry if I don't like your deck or anything else there. I think a deck that I think is not super well positioned, like, is going to be, I'm just going to kick it off. Let's go Terrapagos. I want to put this as not well positioned, but I think it ends up becoming mostly playable-ish. Mostly playable-ish is kind of like my category that I'm going to kind of put for decks that you could play. They can win games. It's not impossible. They're just a step over. I wouldn't recommend playing them. I probably would not play these decks because it's a 2 out of 5 if we're giving it a rating. In terms of just like playability. Terrapagos, I think the rest of the format just doesn't really like revolve around it very well. It did at one point, and now like the decks have just kind of changed. Other decks that I think are well positioned. I think Terrabox to me is a very well positioned deck. It seems pretty strong. Actually, I'm gonna put it at kind of well positioned because as I'm doing this, I'm like, you want to know what? There was the Rabska Gardevoir. So I think decks that are blocking bench damage from Wellspring are probably going to go down a tier. So it previously was very well positioned. I'm like, you want to know what? No, it probably goes down a spot. And I think Enzoric, for the same reason of Gardevoir with Rabska being both the finalist deck in Milwaukee, seems pretty reasonable. Joltik Box to me seems like it's above a kind of well positioned deck into a very well positioned deck. Seems pretty strong, especially if you're able to build it into Gardevoir by including Volcanion or Vitality Band or anything else like that. Iron Hands to me is probably like Future Box. It's probably like this deck kind of exists before Joltik Box, and I think Joltik Box kind of took the crown. So if I'm choosing a deck, I'm either between not well positioned or mostly playable-ish. I think it's probably just not super well positioned in our format. Same thing, I'm gonna go Hydreigon immediately off the bat and Slowking. We're just going bam, bam, bam. Slowking because of Rabska reasons, Hydreigon due to Rabska reasons. Same thing that we're going to carry on in next format with Slowking reasons. Turbo Iron Hands just hasn't really, or Future Box hasn't really done it too well. For Alligator, Gardevoir's up there, where Alligator's going to struggle against that deck. Still doesn't even all the time beat decks like Dragapult, and there's plenty of decks that are beating it. So I think it's like if there was a step above not well positioned, I'd probably put it here. But we're being mean today. Sorry for Alligator. I hate you for Alligator. Our Chaladon is pretty mostly playable, not really cutting it. Blissey, I think is going to be probably in the mostly playable category. Charizard, slightly better than usual. I think it's going to be like mostly playable-ish, but it's like pretty low on the mostly playable. Our Chaladon Poison, I think, kind of falls into these kind of well-positioned decks. I think like having Poison Donk in the Stage 2 format with Joltik Box seems pretty cool. Kabaraja is like mostly playable-ish. Dragapult Charizard, I think, seems I think it's getting more well-positioned. I kind of want something in between like kinda and very well, but based off of its results, I'm going to put it at kind of well positioned. Gardevoir is just going to be one of the best decks in format. It's won pretty much every major, pretty solid. I think Ceruledge, we saw Roscothan. I think it's kind of well positioned. I don't think it's particularly well positioned. Dragapult Dusknoir seems very well positioned in our format, as it continuously does. Dango, Pulse, kind of well positioned. I think that the rest of the Dangos are not as well positioned. They're mostly playable. It's just Dango Pult does not seem as strong as it once was. Raging Bolts. I think Raging Bolts finds itself into the very well positioned deck category. I like that. I also like I'm probably gonna put Dragapult Dusknoir up to best decks category again. I think the Rabsca and Gardevoir makes it a little bit better. Roaring Moon to me seems kind of well positioned in our metagame. Mamoswine to me seems mostly playable-ish. Turbo Moon or Poison Moon. I think I'm going to put it at mostly playable-ish for now. Milotic, I'm going to put it at not very well-positioned deck choices. Charizard, Noctowl, mostly playable-ish. Straight up Dragapults, Slow Pulse. I'm going to put this at the top. A lot of our decks are just kind of like, I think we're kind of at the point where a lot of decks are just kind of like adjusting themselves, but there are some minor adjustments too, where it's like Rabsca is definitely going to affect Enzork and Terrabox. EVBox is very well positioned in the metagame, so we have a really solid 6. Like, our format's really going to be these top 3 and some decks that sort of like revolve around them. Frostlass to me seems like it's kind of well positioned. Great Tusk to me seems it's mostly playable. There's just some decks that just don't really hold up to the Gardevoir, Dragapult. So if your deck A does not beat Gardevoir or Dragapult, you're probably going to be hitting like this immediate brick wall. Like, you want to make sure that you're coming prepared for these matchups. Pidgeot Control does not seem well positioned right now. Hopstation seems mostly playable-ish. Okie dokie, mostly playable-ish. And the one that you probably all want, I think Toadscroll kind of falls into the kind of well-positioned deck. I know that it's not necessarily my most in-depth week of the format, but if you watch any of my previous tier list videos, I've gotten a little bit more in depth. But just to kind of like give a kind of statement where our metagame is, Gardevoir has won pretty much all the majors across the globe when it's come to our Journey Together formats. It's really proven itself as #1 deck, and people aren't really countering it. Dragapult is probably the true best deck in format, but the best players are playing Gardevoir. Not the best players are playing Dragapult. And even like when there's like the top 10 best players playing Dragapult, it's still a tough matchup between Gardevoir. I think like I'm more of a Dragapult player than I am a Gardevoir player, and I think that's really where people kind of have to make these choices. Very few top players have jumped between them. Dragapult Dusknoir is getting a little bit better because of Gardevoir having Rabsca in its build, and I'm assuming a lot of people are going to be playing either Brent Tonnison's build or they're just going to copy Henry Chow and Michael Davidson's list. Slowpoke better against Dragapult Dusknoir, holds its own against everything else. Joltik Box, if you're able to tech it properly, can hold its own against the top decks, but has its own issues. Raging Bolt has kind of been popping up, and it can hold its own against pretty much everything. I don't really feel like it loses against much, but it doesn't have like this great matchup spread. EVBox kind of in the same case, like a lot of your matchups are going to be pretty even. The power level is not as strong as some of these other decks. Then we gotta get into the decks that have kind of like taken a nerf recently, like Terrabox, Enzork, really getting nerfed a little bit from Rabsca being played, and that's all it's enough to kick it out a little bit. I think Archaludon Poison seems kind of well positioned, but it's also been held back a little bit in the metagame, but it does do particularly well against some of these decks at the top. Dragapult Charizard, just like not as good as other Dragapult decks. It might be very well positioned, but I'm putting it there. Cerulege is probably a deck that I wouldn't touch unless Ross Cawthon didn't play it. Dragapult Goldango has kind of fallen down a little bit outside of its Gardevoir matchup. A lot of decks are playing Genesect, and it's just kind of getting hurt. Baby Roaring Moon has not had the results, but I think it holds its own pretty well against Gardevoir, struggles against Dragapult a lot. And then Toadscroll is kind of the new deck on the block. Yeah, sure, it seems okay, but it seems okay. Like, you could play it. Like, any of these decks up here, you could definitely play. This is, like, what rounds out our top 20-ish decks, right? So 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 6, 7, 8, 9. That's, like, top 15. You can choose whatever 5 decks you want as the other one to make the top 20. But these are the top, like, not necessarily top 5, top 10, 6 to 15, right? So, The rest of the decks are decks that have made day 2 and have either not really held up to the format or really not really held up to the format. I think we're going to see some similar results in Bologna because most people are probably testing towards NAIC. People might not take the event as seriously, so we could see some decks slip through the cracks or some locals really have a deep run. But other than that, I think our metagame is pretty set with these being the top 5 or so decks in format, and I think we're going to see a lot of them when it comes to gameplay. Hopefully this video has been kind of informative towards you as you kind of get prepared for whatever tournaments you're playing in, but we will have lots of Destined Rivals content, so stay tuned for all of that as we approach NAIC and the Destined Rivals release dates. Want to support the Shuffle Squad? Be sure to check out all of our sponsors in the description to pick up Pokemon TCG singles, sealed, and PTCG live codes.
Tabi no hajimari wa tsune ni michi e no ippo de aru. Sore wa yami e to tsuzuku. 初めの一歩を踏み出すには勇気がいる。そして旅の終わりには旅を始めた時の自分とは別人になっているかもしれない。旅に出よう。物語の次の章がお主を待っている。将軍の道を歩め。侍の箱とともに。アルティメットガードが送る冒険の第一章。刀将軍の道近日発売。
Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed the content that we have today, and maybe you'll click on one of these other videos, enjoy those videos too. If you haven't already, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments what video you want to watch next. Until next time, we'll catch up with all y'all later. Have yourself a great day.